Greetings. This lecture is on stakeholder theory and specifically addressing stakeholder theory and how it fits into the concept of corporate social responsibility. We're going to compare and contrast sort of Milton Friedman's view of shareholder primacy and how that relates to Edward Freeman's idea that stakeholders and addressing issues of stakeholders is really an imperative for business success. The next few slides will be refreshing you on ethical decision making and then getting into the discussion about stakeholders versus shareholders and who's more important. One of the key principles of stakeholder theory is that when we are doing business, we don't stand in isolation from other companies, other constituents, and customers or suppliers. And in fact, business is about all the relationships that we engage in, some with customers, some with suppliers, some with peer institutions, some with joint ventures. Business is about building relationships, whether it's a relationship with a customer or a supplier or a relationship with our employees. So part of the job of the manager is to focus on which relationships are important and which ones need to be nurtured as much as is possible and as is feasible. The goal and the assumption behind stakeholder theory is that when we make value for all of our stakeholders, and it doesn't mean that we give away the farm, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about helping to create value for everybody, a win-win agreement, if you will. When we can do this, when it is feasible, the goal here is we should be looking towards how we can support others. Also, people can and do accept responsibility for the consequences of their actions. So it's really important that we take ownership of our own failings and take credit where credit is due for things that we do right. But clearly, when we recognize that we've had an impact on somebody, we need to address that. We need to make sure that we're taking care of those constituents that we may have hurt. Whether it was purposely or not, we still have a duty, if you will, to make sure that we handle those sorts of issues. So as we think about duty and we think about relationships, and we think about taking ownership of the impact that we have on others, particularly in the context of stakeholders, you can see why it's really important that we think about ethics and ethics within the relationships of the concept of corporate social responsibility and giving back to others. So, as the question asks, who is a stakeholder? And basically, it's really anybody who can affect the organization in some way or another, or can be affected by the actions of the organization. So whether or not somebody has an influence on you as the corporation, or whether you do something that influences part of society, it's a big giant Venn diagram, if you can think of it in any other way. Anybody that you do business with or you have a relationship with at one level or another is considered a stakeholder. Now, some stakeholders are more important than others, and we'll get into some of those nuances in a bit, but it's really important to recognize that stakeholders vary and are wide in terms of their influence on you and vice versa, and it's not a narrow group of people are the only ones you should be paying attention to. And for example, only your shareholders, because if we did everything that just our shareholders wanted, that may create problems with the relationships we have with so many other organizations and may actually hurt us in the long run. So, just to refresh you on the ethical decision-making process, remember we talked about this 8-step process. How do we identify our issues and then ultimately choose an action and monitor those outcomes? And in the midst of that is the impact on the stakeholder. Who has an interest, what is each person's motivations, and how much power does each stakeholder hold? And this is a big part of the ethical decision-making process, is not assuming that every stakeholder is equally weighted. Some are more important, some have greater interests, some have more power. That's not to say that we don't care and don't want to focus on shareholder issues. They're important. They're essential, actually, but they're not the only shareholder. They're the only stakeholder, rather. It's really important that we recognize if we're going to make an impact and we're going to make a decision, it's going to have an impact on the stakeholders at some level or another. So what benefits do they get from it? What harms do they get from it? Is it right? Is it wrong? Are we hurting somebody? The goal here is that we want to make sure we're assessing fairly and accurately what the impact is of our actions on all the stakeholders. So we begin with the shareholder view of the firm, and in the words of Milton Friedman. He says, and here's a couple of really good quotes from him. Number one, so the question is, do corporate executives, provided they stay within the law, have responsibilities in their business activities other than to make as much money for their stockholders as possible? And my answer to that is no, they do not. So again, Milton Friedman's argument is, we don't have any other responsibility at all whatsoever except making profit. That's the only thing we focus on. And it's a very narrow view, because we have to recognize that if our only focus is on making profit and not thinking about what impact our actions have on others, while in the short term we may do very well financially, in the long term this may hurt us. And we'll talk about issues of externalities and some of those challenges that Milton Friedman never really thought about. And understandable, because it wasn't a big issue when we were the big behemoth in the industry, where we had no natural competition, if you will, after World War II. We were the it. We were the ones that had, that had free reign in the business market. So, again, when Friedman was doing his best work, that was a way long time ago when we were the dominant industry. We were the dominant country in terms of the economy. But it doesn't work that way anymore. Too many people have power that, we recognize if we screw somebody over, it's going to end up hurting people in the long run. Another quote that he has, the most important single central facet about a free market is that no exchange takes place unless both parties benefit. This, I agree with Milton Friedman. We should make sure that when we're creating an exchange, whatever that exchange is, for all stakeholders, that no exchange will take place unless we both feel there's a win-win attached to that. Believe that, hands down. Another quote by Milton Friedman. What kind of society isn't structured on greed? The problem of social organization is how to set up an arrangement under which greed will do the least harm. Capitalism is a kind of a system. So, there's some degree of realism to this, but is greed really what he's talking about? Or, because if we think about virtues, right? Wanting to be successful is one thing. Being greedy is something entirely different. And just because people might naturally be greedy doesn't mean that's the right thing to do. Doesn't mean that we should acknowledge that's the only way to be. So we'll talk a little bit about this idea of greed, but greed is not a good thing. As much as Gordon Gekko and Wall Street would like to tell you that, greed is not good. Greed is the thing that ends up driving people to behave in ways that are inappropriate or illegal, and that can become a big issue and a challenge for us. So in the 1970s, as it says here, here's what Friedman argued, and most people sort of begin and end with this section of this quote. There's one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. And by definition, that's fine. The way people interpret it, though, is it means we're not supposed to do anything else and shouldn't do anything else because it would hurt profits, not help it. And the argument that Friedman would make, Edward Friedman, as we'll get to in a few moments, is that not all activities are equally going to impact on profits. And in fact, we could engage in all sorts of activities that will have an increase in profit, and it's not always direct, but it may be indirect. So we have to think not just in the short term, but also the long term. We have to think sort of broadly about what is going to benefit us and help to increase our profits. Not all things are in the short haul going to draw in profits as much as they might have a benefit for us in the long haul. But here's the challenge. Most people sort of begin and end here and say, well, that means we shouldn't do corporate social responsibility. We shouldn't engage in investing in our local communities and things like that. His argument is, only focus on profits and that's it. But people forget sort of the second half of that sentence and that quote, which is, as long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud, which means we don't lie, we don't steal, we don't behave unethically, we make sure that we have free and open competition. And given that, that makes sense. But the problem is people have a very narrow interpretation of Friedman and believe that all he cares about, or all he really cared about, was shareholder value and that's it. from a narrow perspective, you can see how that would be an easy interpretation. But stakeholder evaluation, in the end, does make money for shareholders. They're not mutually exclusive, and a lot of people interpret it as mutually exclusive, and I think to some extent even Milton Friedman believed that they would be mutually exclusive, but as we can see in a multitude of different situations, they're not. We'll talk a little bit about Tesla. And some issues around Tesla. I think you'll find it sort of fascinating to think about the fact that they gave up patents and their profits and their stock prices went up. So interesting to see how people responded to their decision to decrease their patents, to not follow up on patents and patent lawsuits, and to simply walk away from them because they believe that they want free and an open market and an open exchange of information, and it actually benefited their stockholders in the long haul, not in the short, and even in the short haul. So it's interesting to think, Friedman would probably argue that we wouldn't want to do something like that because it could hurt stockholders, but in fact it didn't hurt stockholders at all. So we'll investigate that a little bit in class. So here are the basic assumptions of the shareholder view of the firm, the assumptions around Milton Friedman's ideals and how his ideals are interpreted. That people vote with their dollars, that pursuing our own self-interest is the best thing that we can do for society. Now, there's a difference between self-interest and greed. The assumption around the shareholder view is self-interest is okay, but when does self-interest become greed? And so I think that was some of the challenges that I think even Alan Greenspan had. He really underestimated the amount of self-interest, i.e. greed, that people would engage in. Hence, we ended up with the financial collapse that we had in the late 2000s. He really underestimated the extent to which people would engage in self-interest. And if people can't self-monitor, who else is going to monitor that other than the government, in that situation? So, the other argument from the shareholder view of the firm is that government should stay out of markets. Again, the assumption is that people are smart enough to self-monitor, right? That they're smart enough to not engage in high, disruptive, unvirtuous levels of self-interest. But we know that's not true. That's the challenge that we have. People will engage in extreme examples of self-interest to take care of themselves only and not think about what impact their actions have on others, but also for their own company in the long haul. Lastly, Friedman's argument, as part of that shareholder view of the firm, is that social responsibility is the responsibility of individuals, not corporations. And he would not see corporations necessarily as a person, so I'm not sure he would agree with the corporate personhood ideal. But regardless, if corporations are considered an entity and they are given rights and comforts, sometimes even equivalent to that which we would guarantee and give to individuals. For example, the ability to give unlimited money to campaigns. They're not voting, but the corporation still has more of a voice than individual voters. So in that circumstance, he doesn't believe that corporations should have the right and the obligation to engage in corporate social responsibility. The interesting thing that we'll see in a little bit is that corporate social responsibility isn't about altruism and giving away money for the sake of giving away money. That's a small aspect of it, don't get me wrong. Corporate social responsibility does include a small aspect of giving for the sake of giving. A, because it feels good. B, because it gives us a tax benefit. So, this is not let's call a spade, right? People aren't going to give money away just for the sake of giving the money away. It's rare that someone gives it away with no thought to the consequences of it in terms of tax implications or things like that. People give because they understand giving is the right thing to do. But the challenge is that we can engage in corporate social responsibility that also benefits our strategic landscape. And in which case then, Milton Friedman would probably agree with this. And as we'll talk a little bit about this when we think about Porter and this idea of strategic philanthropy. Other critiques of Friedman, aside from those that I've sort of inserted in this discussion already and under those assumptions, is that Friedman really did ignore externalities. He really did not think about what the long-term impact was on many behaviors. And Stiglitz, who is another Nobel Prize-winning economist, basically argues whenever there are externalities, where the actions of an individual have impact on others, and it's an unintended impact, right? I didn't pay for that. I didn't expect to get it, but it becomes an impact on me nonetheless. What you didn't directly affect me, but it indirectly affects me. And in those circumstances, when there are externalities, markets just don't work well. And the great examples of this are how we use pesticides because we think that's a great thing for our crops, but what we forget is the impact is on the bees. It's killing bees, and we need bees for pollination. So we're killing insects that are harmful, but are also killing the insects that are beneficial. It was unplanned, it was unintended, but that's an externality that when we think about corporate social responsibility and our obligations to our community, that's something we have to think about. Excuse me. Excuse me again. Factory farming and the use of antibiotics, also a big issue. We think we're helping ourselves because we have harmful bacteria, but what we don't realize is using large amounts of antibiotics are more problematic for us than one would think. So really what Friedman argues for is a real short-term focus over a long-term focus because he really ignores externalities. And so in the short run, if this is going to make me money, that's great. But what he ignores is sort of the shadow that our actions cast, the long-term implications of what we've been doing. So the next couple slides sort of look at some traditional ways of thinking about the organization and its stakeholders. And if you look at this slide here, at the top of the pyramid, which seems to be the traditional, top of the mountain, right? The shareholders, they're the ones that everybody bows to, that they're the ones that we have a responsibility to. Absolutely, we do. But are they more or less important than the employees who do the work on a day-to-day basis? If we don't have employees that we value and are doing good work, the shareholders have nothing, right? I mean, it's not like any one is more important than the other. They're important for different reasons. And the problem is when we only assume that what shareholders need and want are the only things that matter, we're doing this at the expense of our other stakeholders. So, and the other thing too, when we're only thinking about the corporation even in itself, we forget that there's the impact of customers and the community and the media and the government on the things that we do. And this model assumes that they affect us, but that we don't affect them. And that's not true. It's a reciprocal relationship, as we know. And here's a different view. In this view, the shareholders are at the middle. They're the ones that we sort of nurture and protect. And management's job is to huddle around them to keep them protected. And the rest of us out here, and the employees, the government, the customers, that we're all putting this undue influence, and it's management's job to make sure that they're protecting the shareholder interest. Again, it's an inward focus ideal, and it doesn't really honor the fact that we're in a lot of embedded relationships with all sorts of different folks, and each one of those relationships are going to have an impact. And if we don't treat someone well in the short run, in the long run, they're going to come back to screw us. We know this. It's human nature, right? One of the things I want to point out, because if you take any time to listen to Milton Friedman, if you listen to any interviews with him, particularly one that I have in mind is an interview that he had with Phil Donahue a number of years ago. And in that interview, he talked a lot about socialism, and that socialism was bad. And there's a big difference between the idea of being socially conscious and socialism. He uses those terms interchangeably as if socialism is social consciousness, and that's not the case. Socialism, as you should know, is an economic theory. It's the way that we manage the means of production, where a lot of stuff is sort of collectively managed through government ownership, things that seem to make sense, right? Things that should be centralized, like healthcare and things like that, and then they distribute the goods out in a fair way. And there are a number of socialist governments out there, mildly socialist, not talking big C communist, because that's about as socialist as you get, but we're talking about small S socialism, like some of the Scandinavian countries. They have socialized medicine and things like that, and it works quite well. Same thing for Canada. Socialized medicine works extraordinarily well at some levels, and it has its challenges in others. But socialism is about a means of managing production. Social consciousness is not about that. It's not about managing the means of production or having government control over everything. Social conscience means having a sensitivity towards things going on in society and recognizing the impact that you have on those things, and not to be looking at it in a cold and callous way. To have a social conscience recognizes that what we do has an impact, and that, you know, saying you're sorry is a big part of owning that it's important to recognize when you have an impact on things, as we talked about earlier.